In the early years of the Second World War, the Atlantic Ocean was not a battlefield, it was a hunting ground. The German Kriegsmarine, prohibited from building a massive surface fleet by treaty, had poured its genius into a singular, terrifying weapon, the Untersee boat, or U-boat. To the British merchant sailors crossing the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, the threat was not a visible enemy, but an invisible presence lurking beneath the waves. This was the era of the happy time, a period where German captains operated with a level of freedom and lethality that suggested the war at sea was already decided. The doctrine was built on the Wolfpack tactic. Rather than hunting alone, U-boats would spread out in long patrol lines across known convoy routes. When a single boat spotted a smudge of smoke on the horizon, it did not attack immediately. Instead, it shadowed the target from a distance, transmitting a constant radio signal that acted as a beacon for every other boat in the area. Once the pack had gathered under the cover of darkness, they would strike simultaneously. This was a nightmare for the Allies. They weren't fighting a ship, they were fighting a coordinated multi-directional ambush that turned the ocean into a killing zone. For the German crews, this was the height of their prestige. Captains became national heroes, their faces plastered on propaganda posters across the Reich. Men like Günter Prien, who famously penetrated the British naval base at Scapa Flow to sink a battleship, were treated like rock stars. At this stage, the German sailor felt a sense of technical and tactical superiority. They possessed the finest optics in the world, the most reliable torpedoes, and a belief that they were the gray wolves of the ocean. However, the happy time was a period of dangerous overconfidence. The German leadership believed that if they could sink 300,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, the British Isles would starve and surrender. For a while, they were exceeding that number, but the tactical success masked a looming industrial reality. While the German crews were celebrating their victories in the submarine pens of occupied France, the United States was beginning to stir. The U-boat was a precision instrument that took months to build and years to master, but the enemy they were about to face was an industrial machine that viewed ships as disposable commodities. The invisible predator was king of the ocean for now, but the very tactics that made them successful, the constant radio transmissions and the surface attacks, were leaving a digital and electronic trail that the Allies were beginning to learn how to follow. The happy time was not the beginning of a German victory, it was the high watermark before a catastrophic tide began to turn. The hunters were about to realize that the ocean is a very large place to hide, but a very small place to die.
To understand the true horror of the U-boat war, one must look past the propaganda of the gray wolves and step inside the pressure hull. This was not a ship. It was a 67-meter-long steel tube crammed with machinery, explosives, and 50 men. For the duration of a 2-month patrol, this was their entire world, a world where the sun never rose, the air was never fresh, and the concept of personal space did not exist. It was a life defined by filth, claustrophobia, and a pervasive, sickening stench that a man would carry in his skin for weeks after returning to shore. The sensory assault began the moment the hatch slammed shut. The interior of a Type 7 U-boat was a labyrinth of pipes, valves, and electrical cables. Every square inch was utilized. To save weight and space, the boat only had 2 toilets for 50 men. One of these was usually used to store extra food crates for the first half of the journey, meaning the entire crew shared a single tiny latrine that often overflowed or leaked under the immense pressure of the deep. There were no showers. Water was too precious for washing. It was reserved for the cooling systems and the batteries. Within days, the air became thick with the smell of diesel oil, battery acid, rotting cabbage, and the unwashed bodies of men living in 100% humidity. Everything was damp. Mold would grow on the bread, on the clothes, and even on the leather jackets of the officers. The sleeping arrangements were a masterpiece of psychological torture. Because space was so limited, the crew practiced hot bunking. There were only half as many bunks as there were men. When a sailor finished his 8-hour watch, he would climb into a bunk that had just been vacated by a man going on duty. The mattress was always warm, always damp with another man's sweat, and often infested with lice. There was no privacy, only the constant rhythmic hum of the electric motors and the sound of the hull creaking as it fought the crushing weight of the Atlantic. As the patrol dragged on, the psychological weight became as heavy as the ocean above. The men lived in a state of perpetual high-alert boredom. For weeks they might see nothing but gray waves and empty horizons, but at any second the silence could be shattered by the scream of alarm, the signal for a crash dive. Within 30 seconds, every man not on duty would sprint to the bow of the boat, using their collective body weight to help angle the nose downward so the submarine could slip beneath the surface before an Allied plane could spot them. The most terrifying sound in the world, however, was the sound of the boat being pinged. When an Allied destroyer located a U-boat, it would bounce sonar waves off the hull. To the men inside, it sounded like a hammer hitting a metal pipe. Ping, ping, ping. It was the sound of a predator finding its prey. Once the ping started, the engines were cut. The crew would sit in total deathly silence, wearing heavy sweaters to combat the rising cold as the heaters were turned off to save power. They would listen. They would hear the churning propellers of the destroyer passing overhead, and then the click of the depth charge release. A depth charge didn't have to hit the boat to kill it. The shock wave of an underwater explosion could snap steel bolts like toothpicks, shatter the glass on the gauges, and send high-pressure jets of seawater spraying into the cabin. If a battery was cracked, it released deadly chlorine gas, suffocating the crew in the dark. In those moments, these elite wolves realized the truth. They were trapped in an iron coffin miles beneath the surface, waiting for the ocean to decide if they lived or died. This was the Steel Coffin reality, a life of extreme deprivation, followed by moments of absolute, paralyzing terror.
For the German U-boat crews, the spring of 1943 brought a realization more terrifying than any depth charge. The ocean had suddenly become transparent. For 3 years, the darkness of the Atlantic and the vastness of the air gap, the mid-ocean region beyond the reach of land-based planes, had been their greatest shield. But in a matter of months, that shield was shattered by an Allied scientific onslaught that the Kriegsmarine High Command never saw coming. This was the moment the Gray Wolves realized they weren't just fighting sailors, they were fighting physicists and mathematicians. The first blow was the closing of the air gap. The arrival of very long-range VLR B-24 Liberators meant that there was no longer any place in the Atlantic where a U-boat could safely remain on the surface to recharge its batteries. But the real shock was the Leigh Light. Imagine a U-boat crew on a pitch-black night, feeling safe in the darkness, when suddenly a beam of light with the power of millions of candles snaps on from the sky. Within seconds, an aircraft they couldn't see was dropping depth charges directly onto their deck. The darkness, their oldest ally, had been stolen from them. The second blow was electronic. The Allies had developed centimetric radar. Previous radar systems were bulky and easily detected by German warning receivers. This new version used short waves that the German Metox receivers couldn't pick up. To the German sailor, it felt like black magic. Allied destroyers were now steaming through thick fog or total darkness and hitting U-boats with pinpoint accuracy. The German scientists scrambled to find an answer, but they were always 6 months behind. They began to suspect that their own radio transmissions were being used against them, and they were right. A system called HFDF, High-Frequency Direction Finding, nicknamed HFDUF, allowed Allied ships to triangulate a U-boat's position the moment it tapped out a single Morse code message. The Wolfpack strategy, which relied on constant communication, had become a death sentence. The third and most devastating blow was the breaking of the Enigma code. Inside the secret halls of Bletchley Park, Alan Turing and his team were reading the invincible German naval ciphers. When Admiral Donat sent his boats to a specific location to ambush a convoy, the British already knew they were coming. The convoys simply moved, and the U-boats were left patrolling empty water, or worse, sailing directly into a hunter-killer group, a specialized task force of escort carriers and destroyers designed for one purpose: total annihilation. The tactical reality shifted from hunting to survival. The Allies introduced the Hedgehog, a mortar that fired 24 small bombs ahead of a destroyer. Unlike traditional depth charges, these only exploded on contact. This meant the destroyer lost sonar contact during the attack. For the men inside the U-boat, the silence was now more terrifying than the explosions. They would sit in the dark, sweating, listening to the pings of the sonar, knowing that a Hedgehog volley was silently sinking toward them. If they heard nothing, they were safe. If they heard a metallic clink, the boat would be ripped open in a fraction of a second. By May 1943, known as Black May, the German submergent arm suffered a collapse so total it remains unparalleled in naval history. In that single month, 41 U-boats were destroyed. Admiral Donitz was forced to pull his boats out of the North Atlantic. The hunters had become the prey. The German sailors began to refer to their boats as iron coffins, not as a metaphor, but as a literal description. They were being sent into an ocean where the enemy could see through the dark, hear through the water, and read their secret thoughts. The technological American shock had arrived at sea, and it was cold, calculated, and absolute.
By 1944, the U-boat war had ceased to be a strategic campaign and had devolved into a ritual of slaughter. The statistics that emerged from the final 18 months of the conflict are among the most harrowing in the history of naval warfare. For the German sailor, the ocean was no longer a place of hope or victory. It was a vast, cold cemetery. The 75% casualty rate was not a mathematical abstraction. It was the lived reality of every man who stepped onto a gangplank in the bunkers of Lorient, Bergen, or Kiel. Of the 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm, 30,000 never returned. This was a level of loss that exceeded even the most brutal infantry divisions on the Eastern Front. The nature of the crew had changed fundamentally. The legendary Gray Wolves, the veteran captains and seasoned engineers of the early war, were almost all gone, resting in crushed hulls at the bottom of the Atlantic. They were replaced by the children of the Reich. By 1945, it was not uncommon to see U-boats manned by 17- and 18-year-old boys who had received only a few weeks of hurried training. These boys were being sent out in Type 7 and Type 9 boats that were effectively obsolete. They were being told to fight against the combined industrial output of the United States and Britain with weapons that the enemy had already learned to defeat years prior. The atmosphere in the final months was one of quiet, grim resignation. The sailors were not fools. They saw the empty slips in the submarine pens. They knew that when a boat failed to return, there was no funeral, no body, and no grave. There was only a missing report and a silent meal in the mess hall. Yet they continued to sail.
This suicide run was driven by a mixture of terrifying discipline, a sense of duty to their comrades, and the propaganda of wonder weapons like the Type 21 electro boat. They were told that a new generation of submarines, boats that could stay submerged for weeks and travel at incredible speeds, would save them. But like most of the Third Reich's promises, it was too little, too late. Only a handful of these advanced boats ever saw combat. The death of a U-boat in 1945 was often a lonely, unnoticed event. With the Allies controlling the air and the sea, a U-boat was often spotted within hours of leaving the coast. The end usually came from a squid mortar or a homing torpedo. If the hull was breached at depth, the end was instantaneous. The pressure of the deep ocean would cause the steel to implode with the force of a bomb, crushing the air out of the men's lungs before they could even realize they were dying. For those who survived the initial explosion, the end was slower. Trapped in a dark, tilted compartment, breathing in chlorine gas from ruined batteries, waiting for the oxygen to run out in a silence broken only by the sound of the ocean pressing against the metal. When the surrender finally came in May 1945, the order was sent out to all U-boats at sea. Blacken your boats and head for the nearest Allied port. The sight was surreal. Black flags were hoisted on the conning towers, the traditional sign of surrender. As these boats sailed into harbors in Scotland, Ireland, and the United States, the Allied sailors were shocked by what they saw. Emerging from the hatches were not the Superman of Nazi propaganda, but pale, emaciated, terrified boys who looked like they had been pulled from a tomb. They were covered in sores, their clothes were rotting, and many burst into tears the moment they felt the sun on their faces. The legacy of the U-boat war is written in the silence of the Atlantic. Today, hundreds of these iron coffins remain on the seabed, officially designated as war graves. They serve as a grim monument to a generation of men who were used as disposable parts in a machine of total war. The ultimate shock of the U-boat arm was the realization that their bravery and their technical skill meant nothing when faced with the cold mathematical weight of an enemy that could produce ships faster than they could sink them. They had fought for a world that didn't exist, and in the end, the ocean they tried to conquer became their final, unyielding prison.